I'd like to welcome my guests to the program, both out of Washington, D.C. Mr. Webster Griffith Tarpley, author and historian, and Mr. Lawrence J. Korb, U.S. foreign policy and national security analyst. Thank you both for being with us. Well, let's start this off with Mr. Korb. In your perspective, what is Saudi Arabia's goal in its relentless attack on Yemen, both air and ground? Why are they so insisting to continue this onslaught? Mr. Korb? Okay, it appears that I do not have Mr. Korb. Mr. Tarpley, can you answer, sir?
Well, I imagine I have a somewhat different perspective. I think this is an outrageous exercise in mass murder that's seemingly condoned by the international community. You have this degenerate, worse than feudal monarchy in Saudi Arabia and its allies, right, these emirs of the Gulf Cooperation Council, and they've made up their mind that they're simply going to impose a bloody, almost genocidal military solution on Yemen. And this includes, of course, this group that I think we're familiar in the West as the Houthi or Houthi rebels, who are maybe in the north of the country, but this is a legitimate faction inside the country, and they've been joined by the followers of the former President Saleh, who was driven out in those color revolutions of 2011 and at that time. So now we were going to have peace talks next week in Oman, and now the Saudi-backed side, this Hadi in particular, they say, we're not going to have any more talks, no more talks, we're going to have a new offensive. And in particular, they're interested in taking over the oil province, Marib. They'd like to get all other forces out of there so they could monopolize this oil. The hypocrisy of the West is unbelievable. This is a naked aggression, right? There's no UN Security Council. Well, there is, but it came after the fact. And it's, I think, on the wrong side. So the question is, how many American politicians have simply been bought by Saudi money? We know in the era of Citizens United, you can have unlimited secret foreign money pouring in. How many of these people in the Congress here in particular, and the Democratic Party for that matter, say a word about that in a minute, how many of them have been bought by the Saudis? We just had the visit of the Saudi King Salman here in Washington. There was no press campaign about the egregious human rights violations of this, again, degenerate Saudi monarchy. So we've got a situation where public opinion is basically without any orientation.
Well, just looking at what you said, Mr. Tarpley, talking about the, actually they were supposed to start having peace talks. Why now? Why do you think that the Saudis, instead of going to sit at the table, then actually they have become more aggressive at this point in time? Is it that they want the Yemeni people to suffer?
I think it may have something to do with the overall geopolitical constellation. And we know that Saudi Arabia is hysterical about the fact that the Iran nuclear accord has now been accepted not just by the United States, but by the entire United Nations Security Council and Germany and the European Union. The Iran nuclear accord is now part of international law since it has been passed by the Security Council. And the Saudis, of course, were completely opposed to that. They perhaps hid their sabotage a little bit better than the Israelis. So maybe they think that this is now the time to essentially solve this problem with a massacre before the U.S.-Iranian relationship gets back to something more like normal. Let's also remember that the Saudis and the Israelis tend to converge on this. So there's I think there's also that question. Okay. One of the geostrategic goals for all concerned is this Bab el-Mandeb passage, which is, of course, the choke point leading into the Red Sea and the Suez Canal.
All right, stay with me, Mr. Tarpley. Hopefully the technical problem has been solved with Mr. Korb, and hopefully you can hear me, and I will pose that question again to you. Why do you think that the Saudis, can you hear me, sir?
I hear you loud and clear.
Okay, great. Why do you think the Saudis have been so relentless and so determined on trying to crush this, the Yemeni people?
Well, it's not the Yemeni people. It's a group in Yemen called the Houthis who are receiving outside aid, who overthrew the government that existed. It was a legitimate government recognized by the international community, and they were concerned that this would spill over into their territory. They were asked to get involved by the president, who got driven out of Yemen by the Houthis.
What do you say to that, Mr. Tarpley?
I'm afraid the question of legitimacy cannot be posed in this way because, of course, the government that existed a year and a half ago in Yemen was the product of repeated interference, coup d'etat, color revolution, Arab Spring, call it what you will. Obviously, the Saudis are very concerned about their own regime. And well, they might be, because we have to remember, this is an absolute monarchy of a type which has not existed in Europe maybe in 500 years, some might say 1,000 years, dark ages, or you might even say that nothing like this has existed since the Roman Empire. In other words, there are no elections, or there are some sham elections for little local offices, but essentially this is the rule of the House of Saud. And now we're in the 21st century, and everybody wonders, how long can this monstrosity go on? And of course, here in the United States, we have the supreme irony, right? A country founded on anti-monarchism is now the biggest supporter of this, relic of barbarism, this Saudi feudal or pre-feudal
Okay, let me get Mr. Korp's perspective on this. Stay with me, Mr. Tarpley. Mr. Tarpley, Mr. Korp, what about what Mr. Tarpley is saying? We look at the makeup of the Saudi regime, and definitely extremely antiquated and definitely out of place in the 21st century, and yet a country like the United States that allegedly prides itself on freedom, democracy, is its biggest supporter. What is going on? And especially with the situation in Yemen, we see the total silence coming out of Washington.
Well, a couple of issues here. The United States has allied itself with Saudi Arabia after World War II to stabilize the world's oil market, which countries needed to be able to grow economically. The United States doesn't support Saudi Arabia. It sells them a lot of equipment, as the Russians. And if you compare the Saudi regime to the Assad regime in Syria, which with the United States worked in the first Gulf War. If you compare it to what's happening in Egypt, the horrible things that they're doing there, there's no real democracies in that part of the world. Unfortunately, when the Arab Spring started, you had countries like Assad and the Egyptians, crack down on it. The Saudis get military equipment from us. They also get it, from Russia. They get stuff from China. So it's not just us. What we're dealing with here is a country, Yemen, in which you had a government that was recognized by the international community, which was driven out of power and out of the country by a rebel group that received foreign aid, the Houthis, which get aid from Iran. And they were able to do that. And so therefore the Saudis were concerned, because they had talked about coming into Saudi Arabia, and their goal is to put the government that existed before the Houthis, with outside assistance, drove it out of power. And let's not, let's talk about all the things that the Houthis have done since they have launched their rebellion. So yes, there are horrible things. I think we should have a negotiated solution, but the negotiated solution has got to involve the Houthis pulling back from what they've done.
Well, what about that, Mr. Tarpley? What Mr. Corp has said, that he's pointing the finger at the Houthis, but what we see right now taking place in Yemen is an aerial onslaught. Also, we see the ground invasion, and we see the death and destruction that's taking place in that country as thousands of people, of civilians, have been killed, and yet the so-called international community looks the other way. What is behind all of this?
Well, once we say that we want a negotiated solution, the negotiated solution was supposed to be opening up next week in Oman, a neutral country, and that was going to be attended by both. So it is the Saudi side, in effect, the Saudi-backed side, which has said not only will they not go to the negotiating table, but they're going to unleash this biggest offensive that they've ever had. Let's also talk about terrorism. In the past weeks here in Washington, right, because of the Iran nuclear accord debate, we've been hearing about who's the biggest sponsor of terrorism in the world. Well, the biggest sponsor of terrorism in the world is Saudi Arabia, and in particular, who created the civil war in Syria? All of those foreign fighters, crazies, fanatics, brought in, jihadis, brought in by Saudi Arabia, paid for by Saudi Arabia with the connivance of Turkey. And let me point out, not only do they back terrorism in general, but they seem to be able to convince American politicians, probably with some money, that they should not be called to account.
Okay, stay with me, sir. So sorry. Stay with me, Mr. Tarpley. Stay with me, Mr. Corp. We're going to cross over to our Facebook page and see what some of our viewers have to say about this subject.
That bloodthirsty King Salman must be killed for the killing of poor innocent Yemenis and for spreading shame across the entire Muslim world. Hadi's not a Saudi ally. He's a Saudi puppet, and the Saudi family is a U.S. puppet. It's not a war, it's fighting against Houthi terrorism. It's unfortunate that the Zaydis and the descendants of the Imams are under attack from neighboring countries that claim to be Muslims. Why couldn't Saudi Arabia create this Arab army with a seemingly functioning air force to combat Israeli aggression? Perhaps because they're in league with Tel Aviv instead of their brothers in Yemen and Oman due to sectarianism. Saudis might be successful in bringing the whole world at the forefront of war against Yemenis, but in the end, victory is for the rightest ones. I'm sure this ground operation will quickly clear Yemen from the Houthi rebels and restore order to the country. The Saudi monarchy and Israelis are of the same origin. Their forefathers were all the same. That's why today they join hands in killing and destroying the Muslim nations. Shame on Saudis. I support Saudis in their fight against only Houthi terror and not Shia civilians. Saudi Zionists are struggling in Yemen. I salute to Yemenis, the Yemeni army and Ansarullah fighters. They don't surrender to the Zionist Saudis.
What about that, Mr. Corp? Some of our viewers pointed out similarities between the Saudi regime and the Israeli regime, that Saudi Arabia, that claims to be supporting the Muslims and fighting for the Muslim cause. Why do we see such aggression towards another Muslim nation? However, when it came to Israel, bombarding and killing thousands and thousands of Palestinians, mum was the word. Why the difference?
Well, I think, you know, and again, we have to be careful about the phrases that we're using. The Saudis didn't start this. The Houthis, a rebel group in Yemen, receiving outside aid, tried to overthrow the existing government. That's when the Saudis got involved. They did not go in there when you had the government of Hadi. They did not get.
So we're talking about over 5,000 people, Mr. Corp. We are talking about over 5,000 people on the ground that have lost their lives since March the 26th, since this Saudi onslaught has started. Very similar to the type of onslaught that we saw Tel Aviv in dealing with Gaza. And again, the international community is quiet, and again, the people are suffering on the ground. Why is that the case?
Because the Houthis started it. That's why. If you want to blame someone, you've got to blame them. Why did they start this? Why did they overthrow the existing government? When you start a war, you're responsible. Just like in Syria, the demonstrators were peaceful, and Assad cracked down on them. They weren't even armed. Then outside arms began to come in, and you have this war going on now, which the Russians are going to prolong by setting up a base and providing Assad more equipment.
Okay, Mr. Tarpley, Mr. Tarpley, your take,
look
sir.
at the people who start this. The
Mr.
Saudis
Tarpley,
didn't.
your take, sir. Tell me your take on the same question.
I think that Secretary Korb has a somewhat garbled version of history. The forces that were opposing the Assad family had been armed and bloody since the 1980s. On one occasion, they got a whole bunch of military cadets in a hall and killed every last one of them. And that was in the 1980s. So there was no peaceful phase in Syria. That was armed and bloody from the word go. And of course, the incongruity here is rebels in Yemen are bad, rebels in Syria, of course, good. So this is, once again, the double standard and the hypocrisy. But the point I wanted to make is we have currently the Democratic Party frontrunner for president in both New Hampshire and Iowa, although not quite nationwide, Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders seems to be one of the greatest friends, believe it or not, of the Saudi monarchy. He calls repeatedly for the Saudis to take the lead in cleaning up the Middle East. If
So I only have very limited time. What do you think, Mr. Tarpley? Sorry to interrupt you. Mr. Tarpley, stay with me.
Saudi Arabia has the third biggest,
Mr. Korb,
the third biggest military budget. Saudi should intervene.
Stay with me, Mr. Tarpley. Mr. Korb, 30 seconds. What do you think it will take to reestablish security and peace in Yemen?
The Houthis to lay down their arms and let Hadi come back in, and then we can negotiate what we want after that.
And Mr. Tarpley, 30 seconds, your take.
You can't have all those preconditions. Surrender is not a precondition for negotiations. And a lot of people in the Democratic Party want to hear Bernie Sanders repudiate the Saudis for their bloody aggression in Yemen.
And thank you both for being with us on another debate. So sorry we're out of time. I appreciate both our guests out of Washington, D.C., Mr. Webster Griffin Tarpley, author and historian, and Mr. Lawrence J. Korb, U.S. foreign policy and national security analyst. And as always, viewers, we appreciate you being with us for another debate. I'm Marzieh Hashemi signing out for myself and all the crew right here in Tehran. Thanks, and goodbye.